Welcome back to Eco-Criticism 101 and lecture number 13. 13 is split as a lecture, so the first half, basically, we'll deal with romantic poets. These are poets in England who were, in some cases, very concerned about the environment, celebrated the environment, as the name suggests, romanticized the environment. So we'll be looking at Blake, Wordsworth, and Shelley. And these are important folks because the tradition that we've been looking at and moving toward by way of like loco-descriptive poetry and all comes to fruition in these folks. But the other thing noteworthy about them, and with Thoreau too, who will be our second half, we'll get to him in a minute, is that technological modernity is now on the scene. That's the big jump that we've had here, not in terms of literature, but in terms of what's happening in the world. So, the last literature that we had, things like Milton, the end of the 17th century, proto-industrial practices are underway. The beginning of what will become technological modernity is sort of intimated. But it's only in the 18th century that we're going to see large-scale machinery for the working of principally textiles initially come on the scene. And then, that will be first powered by water power and then by coal, which is obviously a fossil fuel. And that begins the so-called Industrial Revolution. The writers that we're looking at today in England are very much aware of that revolution. And England is important, again, historically, in a way it has been in past for different reasons, but England is really the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. It really begins in England in a large way and quickly spreads to other places, other parts of the world, including the northeast of the United States, which is right where Henry David Thoreau is. So what happens in this period is different than what we've seen before. Yes, there have been, environmental issues before. We've had, deforestation from the very beginning of the class. But here we have distinctly modern things like, the growth of factories and industrialization. And the writers that we're going to be looking at are responding to that in different ways. Maybe not directly, and maybe the involvement is even unclear at first, but we know the dynamic by which pastoral works, so that, for example, it may be the case that you have individuals, writing about a pastoral place like Wordsworth will write about a pastoral place, or Shelley as well. And you might not think, well, what's industrialization have to do with any of that? But the preoccupation with those pristine environments, which what will become wilderness conceptually, is alive and well there. The other thing that we have is with Thoreau, a whole range of things will come together, a whole range of issues that we've been talking about. And I'll articulate those, not during this lecture, it'll come with the next lecture, but we'll get an introduction to Thoreau, and he's very important in that regard. So it's worth noting with Thoreau that in a way, with Thoreau, we've been building to him all along. So we'll see that as we go through different things like the concern over consumerism in previous periods and all. Thoreau doesn't exist in a vacuum. He doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. There's been, a movement toward him for a long time. But Thoreau is sort of a culmination of all that, and with it, the beginning of modern environmental era. And that's what makes the sort of structure of this course a little surprising, maybe. I think many people, if they wanted to write a course about the history of environmentalism in America and the U.S., they would have started with Henry David Thoreau. But I don't, or maybe they would have started even more recently with a truly modern environmental era with Rachel Carson. We're going to look at both of those works, but in our approach, they are not the beginning of anything. They're sort of the culmination of a lot. So even Rachel Carson, she's not a writer of literature in the big L sense of the kind of thing that we typically have thought of as literature, but she's been enormously influenced by these previous traditions as well. So I guess what I'm saying is this course up until this point has been moving toward an understanding of how to read Thoreau, the kind of background that he would have had, the kind of issues that have existed in the West moving up to him. And it's also a course in how to read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So now that we've gotten to them proper, we can actually look at modern environmentalism in sort of two waves. 160 years ago with Thoreau, and 60 years ago with Rachel Carson. So let's just jump in and we'll take a look at our Prezi. So here we are, of course, lecture number 13. We've moved up in time. This actually should probably be technically even a little higher. And we're in England here, and we're just getting ready to move over to North America. So lecture number 13, we'll start with William Wordsworth and the Chimney Sweeper. So at this period of time, you're going to see increasing popularity of anti-pastoral. Pastoral is going to be popular in the sense that there's going to be more of it being written, but the nature of it, the type of pastoral that's written. This is the Chimney Sweeper. And I should note that this has been going on for a while, and writing poems about chimney sweepers is an indication of that the first chimney sweeper poem in England, as far as I know, is 1635, and it was written by William Strode. And it will change this sort of, it's not really a genre of poem, the chimney sweeper poem, but this type of poem will change when we get to Blake. And now to give you a sense of where we are with Blake, we're at 1789, so we're at the end of the 18th century. And it's an important poem, and in some sense a milestone poem, because it is really what is really in evidence here is a growing concern over technological modernity and the so-called Industrial Revolution. So, Blake is aware of this happening. It's kind of early in the game. By the time we get to the middle of the century, and Wordsworth would live until then, and Thoreau is writing then. The Industrial Revolution will be well underway in England, and had jumped over into the U.S. as well. But it's interesting in that, let me just jump to the next slide to make this point. So it's like, if you remember those photographs we had, Edward Burtynsky, who was taking photographs of things like strip mining, coal mines, industrial growth today, and the big industrial revolution that happened in the recent decades, of course, was in China, and Burtynsky looks at that. So it's different than traditional pastoral for sure, because pastoral, aware of problems of, so say urbanization and difficulties in cities and all, the knee-jerk response was to turn away and write about beautiful pastoral places. Burtynsky, however, in his photographs, doesn't do that. He doesn't shy away from looking at the problem itself. And that's exactly what Blake's doing here. So it's an important work in that sense. And these are modern issues. So it's not only the environmental issue of chimneys here, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's the exploitation of child labor as well, which gets taken up directly. And, in that sense, by looking directly at these sort of problems, Blake is sort of the beginning, I won't say beginning, but he's in the tradition of Edward Burtynsky, and he's certainly looking forward to this type of pastoral, if you want to call it that, which is looking squarely at the problems of modernity and the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. A very clever thing about this is that Blake appeals to the source of the problem. So if you were to watch the entire film, which we didn't, of Manufactured Landscapes by Ed Burtynsky, you would be taken inside of factories all over the world, and reclamation projects, because to put it broadly, because of the way the film is structured, all over the world, in places like China, Bangladesh, Indonesia. You might think then that the film is about China, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, and it's, of course, The photographs are by an American artist, and the film is created by an American team, and with an American producer and director, and is made for an American audience. So what's up with that? Is this just to give us an idea of what things are like in other places? Well, in part, yeah, but it's really a story about the U.S. And what I mean by that is, all these things that are being done, whether it's in factories in Bangladesh or in China, or whether it's in Indonesia, they're all being done for us in the U.S., in part the U.S., right? This is a global thing, so people all over the planet. But if you think that in watching the environmental devastation there, you're just watching something that's all about another country, that's wrong, because it's about U.S. consumption and what we do. And that consumption, is fueling what's happening all over the world now, and in some cases, horrific social justice inequality, and in other cases, environmental problems. So this little poem does the same thing in the sense that you have a child here speaking, "My father sold me when yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, weep, weep." So, this is almost, it is slavery of a different type than we're used to thinking about, I think, but it's definitely slavery. And as we're hearing from the child here, so your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. So is this about a child in a chimney? Yeah, it is. But it's also about the fact that, you, the audience, are the person benefiting by this. This is all happening for you. It's not something that you are disconnected from. And Blake is wonderfully does that by putting that line in. So looking at what's happening all over the world with manufacturing, is it about some other place? Yeah, but it's about us. It's ultimately about us, and at least in the sense that we have to take responsibility for our chunk of what's going on. And by the way, that would apply specifically to carbon emissions and rise of greenhouse gases. So you could look at a country like China, and you could say, well, China has in this century, the 21st, overtaken the United States as the principal greenhouse emitter on the planet. Well, yes, but if you look at what those emissions are for, roughly around half of them are for the industrial operations that China has to manufacture products that go to the rest of the world. So part of those emissions, part of China's, emission problem is actually shared by the U.S., or should be, because we are the ones consuming, at least one of the countries that are consuming those products. And as a consequence, those emissions are kind of on our shoulders too. If you look at the per capita emissions of a citizen in the United States and someone in China, we are emitting well over twice as much the emissions here in the United States for a person. So over 16 metric tons to a little over 7 metric tons in China. So, what I mean by that is, all things being considered, even though China has more emissions than the U.S., metric ton per metric ton, you have to take into the fact that, China has a population nearly 4 times as much of us as we do, and half of those emissions are coming from their industrial operations. If you back that out, the average person in China is responsible for just half of the emissions as the average person in the United States. So it's really, again, seemingly a disconnected problem from us. It's something that's happening in China or Bangladesh, Indonesia, wherever. But it's actually, we're intimately connected with that, put it that way. Blake actually writes 2 chimney sweeper songs. They're wonderfully illustrated. Blake actually did the illustrations and then went and actually hand painted some of the volumes of these. So they're pretty rare. You can get them in you can see them in some academic libraries or museums, but this is what they look like. So that's a mistake here, by the way, because I say, that The Chimney Sweeper is by William Wordsworth, and it's not. That's a mistake in the Prezi. It's in fact by William Blake. Yep. So this is a pastoral poem by William Wordsworth, circa 1800. I particularly chose this one. There would be a lot of things you could have chosen from Wordsworth, but I wanted one early one that's not too much more recent than what we just looked at, The Chimney Sweeper by William Blake. So pastoral poem. So Virgil is Wordsworth here is firmly in the tradition of Virgil's first eclogue. It tells the story of a lost place, a family farm. Same basic idea in that sense as Meliboeus having lost his farm. And what it's directing our attention to is, an endangered environment, as well as the reason why it is lost. Now, it's a little unusual, and Wordsworth is a clever guy, so he's making it unusual. It's not what you would think, that maybe an industrial city like Manchester, right outside of it, there would have been farms that would have been endangered, and they would have, been converted into either industrial, facilities or maybe housing for people and all. It's not like that, but it's showing that a way of life is now being endangered, and it's being endangered basically because of this new economic system coming on the scene. So Wordsworth, I think it's fair to say, would be more interested here, not more interested, but equally interested, or also interested in social justice issues. So that's what we see happening here with Michael. So let's go through it, and that will become more obvious, I think. First, Wordsworth is well aware of the pastoral tradition. He's read a lot of poetry. He's also familiar with loco-descriptive poetry. He's read Cooper's Hill. He's familiar with the Hill genre. We know this. But what he's doing here is very much in the spirit of Catherine Phillips, as I note here. And that is, he's describing a perfect pastoral place. Locus Aminus, this pleasant place. And he's doing it very much in the spirit of Catherine Phillips, if you remember her translation of Horace's Second Epode, because it's just perfect. There's no reality of the actual countryside creeping in. So, we had that in Shakespeare's As You Like It, where we have an actual shepherd showing up in the play, making clear that, shepherds' lives aren't anything like the way they're depicted in pastoral literature. They're hard and they're difficult. Shepherds often don't own their own property. They're basically just, proletariat workers, except and people have argued this, by the way, starting with Raymond Williams in the 1970s, that yes, you have proletariat factory workers, which we generally think of in terms of something like the Industrial Revolution, but there are also, the same sort of people, same economic standing in the countryside as well. None of that's here. This is just an over-the-top, perfect little valley described here. So it's very much in the pastoral tradition, and that's kind of not surprising because, it's actually subtitled A Pastoral Poem, in case you didn't quite get the idea. So traditionally with pastoral, the challenge, the threat to the pastoral place, you have a perfect pastoral place, what's threatening it? Well, there's often urban life and the growth of, cities and everything that comes with them. And that then is that binary structure, that dyad that we talked about since the very beginning with the Epic of Gilgamesh, where you have what's in the city and what's outside of the city, and what's in the city is good, what's outside is bad. Well, clearly now that binary structure is still in place, but what's in the city is bad, and for hundreds of years now, what's outside of the city is seen as good. So it's all about city life, one way or another, whether it's overpopulation, disease, or whatever. Here, something new is on the scene. It's now new type of economy coming on the scene. It's the so-called industrial revolution coming on the scene. It's capitalist modernity. And that is the threat. And that will continue on now in the same way like Ed Burtynsky would look at like fossil fuels and coal mining and all as a problem. Again, that has nothing to do with cities per se, right? I mean, going to an open pit coal mine doesn't, have anything to do with that. But it's these new problems. And Wordsworth is going to focus pinpoint on the problem as an economic one, as a new economic system coming on the scene. So he's not going to focus, for example, on the machinery and the machinery working, these textiles and all. That will be the focus of a lot of people at this period in time. In fact, just a little over a decade after this poem is written, we have a group called the Luddites, also known as machine breakers, who are basically protesting technological modernity, and the way they do that is literally to smash the machine, break into factories and smash these mechanized machines, and that we're dubbed Luddites in our word Luddite today. We say someone's a Luddite. They're, not, down with the idea of technological modernity. Well, that's where that comes from. But Wordsworth isn't going to focus on that. He's focusing right on the economic change that has happened here. So that's why I call it here capitalist modernity. Michael is also a wonderful loco-descriptive poem. If you look at it here, you're actually, I noted that with more and more lush and lavish description, you're sort of encouraged to sort of step right into an environment that's between the boards of a book. So, close your eyes and you can imagine that you're actually there. Wordsworth is, saying to you, close your eyes and imagine that you're actually walking through it. If from the public way you turn your steps, in other words, you direct your feet up the tumultuous brook of Glen Head Gill. So you're walking along here, your feet must struggle in such bold ascent, the pastoral mountains before you, face to face. But courage to you, keep walking. So you're actually in this environment. It's clever because he wants you to experience this, this pastoral valley, and you walk right out into it. And, no habitation is there. So in the sense of nature is separate and apart from human beings, nature being a place like Yosemite, at least the way it's imagined, even though Yosemite, Native Americans had lived there, had modified it, but it's imagined as this place where there's no one here except a few sheep and, rocks and stones. So the same, importance of loco-descriptive poetry, but really it comes to fruition here with pastoral. So Wordsworth has encouraged us to walk right into it, into the poem itself, and to see that space, but then to ask a question, what exactly happened there? Why is this farm abandoned? And the answer is, and Wordsworth lays it out, well, Michael and his wife own this farm, and they have farmed it, and presumably, it will be farmed by their son as well. But their son is pulled away from the farm because of an economic problem, and that is that, a relative, an uncle had got into debt. Someone had to answer for the debt. The son is sent to go work in a factory to make money to do that. And then presumably he would come back, but he becomes, part of that world and doesn't come back again. And, for the first time in terms of the Industrial Revolution, you have, the problem actually creeping into a place like that. It's not that it's, this is outside of Manchester where, development is happening. It's not like that, but this sort of economic system that puts people in debt that people can't pay off, and then the only way to do it is to work in factories and all. That's a problem. And more broadly, what Wordsworth is alluding here to is that a whole new generation of people, like Michael's son, were moving away from farms towards cities because they thought cities, and this had always been happening in different ways, but here they thought that the what was offered by technological modernity and all, the Industrial Revolution, were these sort of interesting jobs in cities and all. And they turned out, of course, not to be so interesting or so good, but rural life was also, had its challenges and all. So it just seemed better for a whole generation of people. And I would add, not in terms of Michael here, but in the United States, right north of where Henry David Thoreau is doing his Walden experiences, Lowell, Massachusetts, which is the largest industrial center in the United States at that time. And in Lowell, it was often and principally women working in those factories, young women, and they would have lived lives, kind of pastoral-like lives in the countryside. But by, droves, they wanted to go to these new factories because they had autonomy. It was a group of women living together. They, weren't under the sort of patriarchal control of their families that they would have been otherwise. So it was a draw for people away from the countryside and into not cities necessarily, but factory cities in particular. And Michael is drawing attention to that as a problem. So Mont Blanc with the Shelley. So we're moving forward just a little bit in time to 1816 from 1800 before. Mont Blanc, what it is the highest mountain in Europe. This becomes an icon of wilderness. What was happening here, as industrialization is taking off and urbanization has been moving forward for centuries in England, increasingly places that were thought of as wilderness were being fetishized. And wilderness originally just means wildness. The problem is, because England has been developing for the last few hundred years, there's very little wilderness in England. There are a few places like the Lake District where Wordsworth will ultimately move and live. But if you really wanted wilderness, you had to leave England because the island's just too developed. And one of the icons of wilderness in Europe will be Mont Blanc, which was the tallest mountain in Europe. So it's kind of, in a limited European way, the equivalent of Mount Everest or K2 or something. Like, it's the largest mountain that people know about. And it was a challenge to even climb it, and it wasn't until 1786 that it was actually climbed. So if you really want wilderness, the place closest where you could go would be Mont Blanc. And, so it's not in England, but it is in Europe, in the Alps. So that would be it. So this tells us some things right away, and that is that, again, wilderness is being fetishized and it's appealing. And this is a big shift, right? It's a 180-degree reversal in some sense what we saw in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the wilderness, the wildness outside of the city, including, Enkidu was initially this wild man. That's not something that people value as much by any means compared to the culture of the city, the protected culture of the city. But now that's different. In a place like England, where everything has come under human control and everything is now modified, people are beginning to think, well, what about true nature in the sense of being free of human habitation? And you can find little places here and there in England, but if you really want to get somewhere wild, true wilderness, you have to go to a place like the Alps and to Mont Blanc and all. And this preoccupation with wilderness, right, this is 1816, it's, early in the 19th century, but this will continue in a huge way throughout the 20th century. Henry David Thoreau, we're going to get to directly, obviously is very much of this sort of preoccupation with wilderness mindset. So more on Mont Blanc. So wilderness to Shelley and the Romantic poets, and that would include Blake and Wordsworth and others, of course, and not just in England, but the Romantic movement was throughout Europe in different places, like in Germany, especially with people like Friedrich Hölderlin and all. So Shelley writes that this poem was composed under the immediate impression of the deep and powerful feelings excited by the objects which it attempts to describe, and is an undisciplined overflowing of the soul, rests its claim to the appropriation of an attempt to imitate the untamable wilderness and inaccessible solemnity from which those feelings sprang. Yeah, well, that's a very poetic way of saying that. This is about wilderness, but the emotional encounter with wilderness. So we didn't read them. I thought about anthologizing them in the reader, but in addition, during the 18th century, there were two thinkers in particular, Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, who talked about something called the sublime. And what was the sublime? Well, it was an encounter that one had. It described the encounter, the emotional encounter one had with nature, but a certain kind of nature. So pastoral, in a way, is about that encounter too. But as we've noted, that the nature is very much an already modified one. People may think, the Greeks may have thought, that, rolling hills with sheep on it is pure nature in the sense of untouched by human beings. And in the sense that there are no houses or let alone factories there, I suppose that's true. But as we know, that's been modified, and that sort of very inviting landscape is different from like a true wilderness area. And what Burke and Kant argued in different ways is that when we encounter true, all-inspiring nature, that all that it inspires is an overwhelming feeling that we call the sublime. And the sublime means you're, as much attracted to nature as you are repulsed by it in the sense of afraid of it. And that, by the way, has been the way that many people have encountered over the centuries, have imagined how human beings thought of God in the sense of the Christian God. What I mean by that is both, of course, drawn to God because God is good and all that, but also, fearful and almost repelled by the notion of God because God is so powerful and so all-inspiring. That awe-inspiring, both sort of attraction and repulsion, is basically what we mean by the sublime. And Shelley's trying to talk about that here, this sort of overflowing of the soul. What he's experiencing there is, trying to talk about this untamable wilderness and this inaccessibility and all. He's really trying to talk about his emotional encounter with Mont Blanc, which is, again, one that is, sublime. It's a little confusing because this is a technical, sort of philosophical, and certainly literary term in this period, but we use it in a very sort of contemporary, kind of haphazard way. That was really a sublime meal. It's not what Burke or Kant meant exactly, but rather that it's something that's just so awe-inspiring because, again, it's both, it pulls you in, and yet it's frightening as well. Another important point here is that the environment, and at least wilderness like Mont Blanc here, is almost a place of worship. Thou art ravine of our dark, deep ravine, thou many-colored, many-voiced vale. And, as he goes over it from the ice gulfs and gird their secret throne, it's described almost like, sort of a holy place where you have this experience not of God, but of nature itself. This will dominate the way that wilderness is seen, this attitude, even though it's early in the 19th century, it will dominate from here on out, really, in the U.S. mindset in any event, how nature is imagined, how wilderness, the parts of the earth separate from human beings, where human beings haven't encroached, what is it like to be there? So you're experiencing this sublime thing, and I noted that it's kind of like the way people imagined their relationship with God, both attraction and sort of fear and repulsion. Not repulsion in the sense that God is like evil and you'd be repulsed by him. I don't mean that, but it's just so frightening that one could imagine, in this Christian tradition, if you're actually in the in the actual, location with God, and you saw God and you moved toward God. I mean, you may want to run up because you're attracted instead of, embrace God or something. But, at the same time, you'd be fearful and, drop to your knees or something. And that's what's being said here. So that's the attitude toward wilderness. What a difference that is, because, a few centuries before in Christianity, the idea, in European thinking, was that, one, wilderness is really scary. And I mentioned you have people like John Evelyn who encountered the Alps, these same mountains, 200 years before, not even 200 years before. And, Evelyn was just, he didn't have the attraction part. He was just, very frightened of the whole thing. But also in Christian thinking, the earth in general is seen as this potentially, the playground for evil where Satan is alive and well and is in control. But no, with wilderness especially, there's no sense in these writers that it's corrupt in the sense that it's, been corrupted by evil. And why not? Because it's free of human beings. But it's seen as, well, maybe another way of putting it, if you wanted to go to commune with God, have a relationship with God, in the sense of, if you wanted to sit down and pray or talk to God, where would you have gone a few centuries before, the most holy of places? Well, you would have gone to a church. That's what that was for. It was almost imagined as sort of like this place to be with God and feel the presence of God. Here, the place to feel the presence of God is clearly being said to be wilderness. Wilderness is this imagined wonderful place that is, the exemplary places on the planet. Again, it's not like pastoral, this modified environment, this picturesque thing. It's not like that at all. But it's this all-inspiring place where you can actually experience God. And that's a remarkable change, right? Both sort of theologically, to see the earth not as fallen and debased, but rather as this all-inspiring temple for God, and also to see these places as no longer fearful, but both fearful in the sense of having sublime fear, but something else too, which is attraction. Yeah. So you have here the notion that, nature is no longer something to be feared or exploited necessarily, but to be appreciated, even worshipped. And that is a view that will continue roaring through the 19th century into the 20th and 21st. In that sense, if you want to understand U.S. attitude, like American attitude, what an average American would say about about wilderness, about a place like Yosemite or the Grand Canyon or something, the attitudes that we feel, we may think that they're sort of intrinsically ours, that we're born with them, but it's not true. It's actually being written down and worked out in this period. The way that we think of a place like Yosemite is because of this tradition here. And unlike the writers we've seen before, some attitudes have, gone by the wayside over the centuries, but this hasn't. This is still alive and well. Our principal way of understanding nature as wilderness comes from this period. And that's changing, I would argue, but we don't need to concern ourselves with it right now, but just to put a little footnote. And then in the era of the climate crisis, we're beginning to think of things differently in a different kind of global way and all. But in any event, our appreciation of wilderness, our attitude toward wilderness and all, really is forming in this period. And because we're so close to us now, it hasn't been supplanted. So this is an 1818 painting, so 2 years after Wordsworth writes Mont Blanc, and it's Caspar David Friedrich, and it's Der Wanderer über dem Nibelmeer, which is the wanderer among the sea of fog. And this, I think, wonderfully shows the attitude on display there. So imagine, having the encounter with Mont Blanc that Shelley is talking about. What would it be like? Well, this sort of visually represents it. This is, distinctly European person here, notably a wealthy white male person who is the sort of subject here. And he has, in this painting, climbed up this sort of rocky area here, which would, anyone else would see incredibly dangerous. And, by the way, he's not wearing mountaineering clothing, which I think is kind of amusing in that, he's just like walked off the street of London and he's there. And that's kind of the idea. And he's experiencing nature and all its wilderness and all its wonder and majesty, and also intense frighteningness, right? I mean, this is not on the beaten track. This person has gone to, one of the most frightening areas to experience nature. This is sort of like the encounter with the sublime here. This is what it would look like. It's still, I would argue, very anthropocentric. And, if you do the sight line here, if you go across the corner here, and across the corner here, you're squarely centered on that subject. In terms of, we've seen different works of art, like back with Claude Lorraine in the mid-17th century, where the human presence is very small in the painting. Human presence here is very large. It's all about the human being. It's all about the eye experiencing this. And just as kind of a little, we'll get to Thoreau actually directly, but a little spoiler for Thoreau. Thoreau spends a lot of time talking about that eye, the sort of subject experiencing it all. But yeah, that's basically the encounter that we see with European wealthy white men having with the environment at the time. That's the experience of the sublime. That's visually sort of depicting what I guess Shelley would be thinking of with the poem Mont Blanc. This is Mont Blanc. You can see it early 17th century, and this is it today. Swiss mountain. You notice that it has more snow on it here, glaciers. Those are receding now because of the climate crisis. We have less and less of that. But still, a very large, very frightening mountain at the time. And this is, by contrast, the Fairfax Horseshoe, which is in the Lake District, which is actually right, if you go down here, sort of off the shot. Wordsworth actually lived right here in the little town of Grashmere in the Lake District. This kind of looks the same, maybe the snow on it and all, but this is just a winter snow sort of dusting it. Most of the year there's no snow on it. And it's I don't know how to put it. It's not nearly as large, as frightening or anything. So I've actually climbed this and hiked it. And in about a 12-hour period, you can walk the whole length of it and down. And it is just a walk. There's no sort of technical climbing or anything like that. There's not even, well, in England, they make a distinction. What they call hiking there rambling. And you can just ramble and do this, which means just sort of walk, as opposed to what they call a scramble. And a scramble is where you have to use your hands and your feet to sort of climb with your feet as you're walking. But here it's not like that at all. And it's just a fraction of the height of Mont Blanc. So you can see why people like that's where Wordsworth lived. But you can see why people like Shelley would want to go to Europe proper, or to places where there really are, there really is wilderness and really high mountains, because England just didn't have anything like that. I mean, this is the closest you're going to argue, because it's one of the tallest peaks in England. It's the closest you're going to get to something like Mont Blanc, but it really doesn't compare at all. Okay, so now we're kind of moving to our main event, which is Henry David Thoreau and Walden, which is published in 1854. Just a note on that date, Thoreau actually lived at Walden Pond He lived there for 2 years, but it was at the end of the 1840s. So it's like 1848, 49, where Thoreau is living there. And then it takes him a while to put the book together. So that matters because the book recounts things like his encounter with, slavery in the sense of his not paying taxes to support slavery in the United States and being put in jail. That wasn't in 1854. That was in late 1840s that happened. So technically, you would call Thoreau a romantic poet. You wouldn't call him a romantic poet, although he shares a lot of things with them. So what I mean by that is romantic poets, and we just saw it with like Wordsworth and Shelley, they often have a preoccupation with wilderness and nature. It's one of the signature things that makes them who they are. In that sense, Thoreau is kind of like a romantic poet because they're certainly in his era. So even though what we just looked at with Wordsworth and Shelley, respectively, from 1800 to 1816 was the beginning of the 19th century, the Romantic movement in England will continue for the first half of the century, basically. So it's a very kind of a clear overlap with Thoreau. But Thoreau isn't technically a romantic poet in this sense, and by that I mean with the big R. He's part of the American Transcendentalist movement. And that was basically founded, and one of the principal motive forces behind it was his friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. They also romanticize wilderness, but in a different way. So it's a distinctly American kind of thing. And when we look at those two movements, Romanticism and American Transcendentalism, scholars will note the differences between the two. But from our point of view, there's a lot of similarity with them. And Transcendentalists were influenced, just like the Romantic poets in part, by things like Romanticism in Germany. But American Transcendentalists, even more than that, by the sort of philosophical movement of what's happening in Germany at the time. And it will be on display when we read Walden, Eastern religion and Eastern and mysticism, both mysticism coming in the Western tradition out of the medieval period and onward. So we've seen the encounter of the West with other traditions here and there. Well, we haven't really focused on it, but trust me, here and there it does happen in the centuries leading up to this. But there's a real, to kind of borrow a phrase from Hermann Hesse, a real journey to the East in the U.S. at the time, because people like Emerson and Thoreau are reading Buddhist texts, they are reading Hindu texts, and they are trying to, understand that religion. And it will crop up in Walden in particular. So we haven't really seen the encounter of the West with other cultures, but here we're in an era where people like Thoreau are encountering other cultures. So, Thoreau really made a religion of wilderness. So Thoreau is certainly in the Christian tradition. You can certainly see that tradition all over Walden, but if you were to ask him, his real religion is wilderness. It's nature, with a capital N. So in the same way that, it became it's been a convention for, I guess, almost a couple hundred years to capitalize God in England in writing. Well, now nature is being capitalized like God, and nature is being revered the way that God had been with Thoreau. So if you had actually gotten the hard copy of Walden, you don't need to now since I put it all online, but the Dover edition, which I used to work with, had on the back, which is still useful. For a naturalist, essayist, and early environmentalist Henry David Thoreau, nature was a religion. And why does Thoreau, move to Walden Pond, to the nature there and all? Nature of the place? It's really sort of the move closer to God. It's to be, right in a place that has almost a religious feel to it because of that. And again, how striking that is, that, the earth will be embraced as a sacred, holy place when it had been eschewed as a sinful place for centuries. And you can see how this is a blending of religious thinking and environmentalism here. Now, it will not always be the case. In fact, many people today are sort of, dragging their feet on things like climate change, action, because they're not buying into this. They still think the earth is fallen and debased. But coming out of the Christian tradition here were people who were deeply, deeply reverent of the planet. And this is early environmentalism. So early U.S. environmentalism, you have to remember that it is coming out of this Christian tradition, but not necessarily in a bad way. But I mean, it has postured people to have that sort of reverence to the planet that they had been, developing for centuries toward their deity. Yep. The thing to remember going into Thoreau is that Thoreau may make a lot of sense to you. Thoreau's attitudes toward nature, toward wilderness, toward the earth may seem spot on. The reason for that is Thoreau, again, is close enough to us at 160 years that the attitudes that he, helped develop are still alive and well today. He would have been new in putting them out there, and the average reader of Walden would have felt differently toward it than we do today. But it's kind of like circular reasoning. The reason we're sympathetic to it today, or it makes sense, and the environmentalism there makes sense to us, is because this book helped write that environmentalism into being, and a few generations later, all of us are heirs to it. So it's an intriguing idea here that Thoreau is so important that he constructed part of our idea of wilderness and nature. But with it will come an environmental ethic, a modern environmental ethic. So that's an epic. So that's why people will often look to Thoreau as the beginning of modern environmentalism in the United States, because he helps bring that into being. Although, as we'll see when we start going through him point by point, he's not the first person that creates it. We've seen a lot of it coming into being already in the course. So Thoreau's background is important to note, I think, to sort of frame him for us. He's relatively wealthy, so some of this material I'm going to go over now I have included in that introduction that I wrote to Walden that you'll be reading, but let me just unpack it a little here. His family, his father owned a factory in town, so in Concord. So if you're thinking about industrialization, the so-called Industrial Revolution, the rise of technological modernity, Thoreau is right in the middle of that, to the point that his family and the wealth that he inherits and the wealth that he would have, that would have been used to send him to Harvard, it's coming from a factory. And that factory is just one of many coming on the scene. And 15 miles north of Walden Pond, where Thoreau does his experiment for 2 years, is Lowell, Massachusetts, which was the largest industrial operation on the planet at the time. So even though Thoreau doesn't talk a great deal about factory life, he does make a few mentions of it here and there in Walden. It was all over the area, but it really was, really came home for him in a personal way, because he was from a factory owner family, but he is very wealthy. And I think, as I noted in the introduction that I wrote to Walden, as a consequence, what Thoreau does at Walden Pond is sort of a game that he plays at. He doesn't have any of the reality that it would for some other people. And what I mean by that is someone, if you had no money and you just had to, try to build some little building on Walden Pond and take care of yourself and all, it would be very different than Thoreau, who can just go home at any time and, have a home-cooked meal with his family, which he did weekly. Yep. So one thing to keep in mind here is to sort of put this back into its proper historical context. Because Thoreau is wealthy, this seems like an unusual thing for him to be doing. He has to explain why he's doing this unusual thing and moving into a little building this small to his readers, who again would have been literate, wealthy people for the most part, men often. So the thing we don't realize, though, because you're kind of locked into that perspective of Thoreau, his perspective, which is, again, sort of a wealthy person's perspective, is that most people at the time lived in conditions not that different than, the little cabin at Walden Pond. So let me actually go to the next slide here. He actually draws attention to in Walden that his cabin was built in part out of another little cabin, references a shanty owned by an Irish laborer named James Cullen. So at this point in time, the history of the United States has been the history of immigration, right? That we're a country of people from all over the planet. And, right now there's been, so much talk with the border and walls and all that with, people coming from below our southern border. But at this point in time, the immigrants to the country would have been Irish, for example. And similarly, there would have been a lot of suspicion and anger toward that group of people coming from the people who were in America or the United States already, who may have only been there for a generation or two, but they felt, because they were born there, that they were the true Americans. And these, immigrants coming in, these Irish people, for example, were not. So this family, because they're new to the country, and I guess there's a child would have been first gen, but basically they're new. They would not have had a lot of money, and they wouldn't have had social standing, and moreover, they wouldn't have had much in terms of a house. So this whole family of three, Collins and his partner and their child, lived in a building about the size of Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond, which was actually built out of the cabin or shanty that James Collins and his family had. And when Thoreau buys it, then they have to move on, and there they are walking down the road. One bundle they have with them held everything: their bedding, their coffee mill, their chickens are with them, and all. So it's just important to note that even though for Thoreau this was like super minimalizing and downsizing and a very unexpected thing for someone of Thoreau's social and economic standing to do, for a lot of Americans at the time, especially those new to the country, this was the reality of life. Reading Walden wouldn't have been anything striking to them, and why would someone want to do this and live this way? That was the only life they had open to them, the only life available to them. So it's just always good, I think, to foreground the sort of privileged position that Thoreau occupies, and sort of not buy into his belief that, this is like a real downsizing and all. I mean, yes, it is for him, but it wouldn't have been for most Americans at the time, many Americans. So Thoreau is aware of Ben Jonson. He mentions Ben Jonson in Walden. It's important to realize that Walden is a student in this class in English 22 a few years back wonderfully made a little joke that, if you go to a bookstore or you go online, whether online or to a brick and mortar one, and you will see there are these sections of how-to manuals and all, and a lot of ways involving like self-improvement and all, I guess. But one of the genres is how-to manuals, how to get rich for people who don't have a lot of money. And that's sort of a preoccupation today in general, how to do that. But Thoreau's is also a how-to manual, how to live as if you're poor, even though when you, or at least your family, has relatively a great amount of money. So it's kind of it is just that. It's not a how-to manual for people who have to live that way, but a how-to manual to how to not need the things that we think are essential in life. Now, there's something funny about that, for sure, But, in terms of Thoreau being sort of the great grandparent of the modern minimalist movement, that's kind of a necessary thing for many of us in the United States and in, wealthy countries in general. In other words, we live lifestyles now that are far more than adequate for human beings, right? Most people on the planet are like James Collins, even today in the 21st, are like James Collins and his family, just getting by, living in, very rudimentary houses and all. So, or certainly smaller, like dwellings and all. But we in the wealthy countries like the U.S. have, adopted a lifestyle where we have all sorts of things and big houses and cars and lots of clothing and on and on and on. And what Thoreau is saying, because Thoreau is in the same situation, found himself in that boat. Well, can I get by and live with less than that? So on the one hand, we can kind of be critical of Thoreau because he's just playing at being poor, and he's not, when he's not really, at least his family's not. But he's saying something different here that I think applies to us because a lot of us are in that boat in the, wealthy countries. We have just so much more than we need. So how do we, in Thoreau's situation, which we're basically in. We may not be exactly as wealthy as Thoreau's family would have been, but we're still like that. How can we get by with a lot less? And that's why, it resonates with modern minimalism, and modern minimalists will look back to Thoreau for that reason. But again, minimalism itself is not something that you would encourage people all over the planet to do. In other words, you might say to people in the U.S., maybe all your friends, maybe every one of them, I don't know, you should really think about being a minimalist. People should think about getting by with less and less and less. And to a lot of people in the U.S., not everyone has, a lot of money and a lot of stuff, but to many of us, we do. We could get by with a lot less. But you wouldn't give that same advice to people in different parts of the world. So, we've talked about like Bangladesh and all. Yeah, I mean, that would be, it would be an odd and almost nonsensical thing to do with people who are, whether in Thoreau's era like James Collins or people today all over the planet who are living with very little. The issue is not that they need to minimalize. That's, if anything, they need to acquire more in the sense of, the basic rudiments of living today, and things like running water and all that we take for granted, people across the planet don't take for granted, don't have anything to do with. So, just to frame the project here, because it's a little confusing, Thoreau writes about it in Walden as if the whole experience took 1 year. And he wants to do that for different reasons, like he wants to tie it to the cycles, the seasons of nature and all. But actually, it was 2 years that he spent there. And he talks about it like it's a solitude there. And I'm sure there's a lot of solitude that he was alone. But he had visitors all the time. And he went to Concord pretty much every day. And Concord's just a mile away. It's just, a 15 or 20-minute walk. It's not very far. So it's just important to realize that even though, and I, explain this in some more detail, I guess, in the introduction to Walden that I wrote, even though he talks about it like it's wilderness, you might think he's up somewhere in like a remote area of Alaska or something. Yeah, it's not. It's kind of like a local park where he is really, and he does not spend his life there. It's just a relatively short portion of his life, 2 years. So Thoreau, and you may know him in this context from other classes, even high school, as an early protester of slavery. And I developed that further in the introduction to Walden. But, he will write, and so note this date here, 1849. That's earlier than Walden. Walden published in 1854. So Thoreau lives at Walden Pond for 1848-49, and then leaves, and almost I want to say almost immediately, it's like a couple months after he leaves Walden Pond, he then gives a speech, a public speech, that will become that essay on civil disobedience, which will be published in 1849. So right after leaving Walden Pond, he gives this milestone, incredibly important lecture that becomes an essay. The lecture wasn't that important; it wasn't attended by that many people, but the text that it becomes on civil disobedience be enormously influential on people like Tolstoy, and in the 20th century, maybe most notably, by Mahatma Gandhi and MLK. And because he lays out the idea of passive resistance there, and specifically in terms of the Civil War. So it's a very simple project that Thoreau has, and that is, if you want to stop slavery in the United States, maybe there's a way of doing it without going to war. That didn't happen. We had to go to war in the U.S., but his idea here is simply that what if you stopped all your support for slavery? So if you stopped paying taxes that, helped a system that supported slavery, could you do something like that? And that, that idea lands lands with both Gandhi and MLK because they take that idea and run with it because, in Gandhi's case, wanting to free India of British colonial rule, how can you do that without having a bloody conflict? And the answer is passive resistance, and that goes back to Thoreau. Walden, Thoreau notes that I was seized and put into jail because I've related elsewhere related. And by the way, that is a reference to, so this is in Walden in 1854, but as I have related elsewhere is a reference to the 1849 essay on civil disobedience, that he did not pay taxes to or recognize the authority of the state which buys and sells men, women, and children like cattle. So incredibly important, and it's intriguing, right? Unfortunately, it is unfortunate, but what I mean is it's intriguing that Thoreau will then become influential on MLK during the civil rights movement, and the same issue is being addressed. The original act of civil disobedience, as Thoreau puts forth, is to fight slavery, and MLK is using it to fight the remnants of slavery, which is the racial inequality in the United States in the civil rights issues regarding it in the 1960s principally. And it's still amazing that the issue is so alive and well today, with the Black Lives Matter movement, that, it still has to be addressed in huge ways. And so interesting in terms of Thoreau's legacy, civil disobedience is the principal way. So the sort of peaceful protest of it. It's not like this is erupting all over the United States, the BLM movement in bloody riots or something. It's not, because this is a peaceful movement inspired in part by Thoreau and the people that he in turn inspired, like MLK. So it's just a sad commentary that we're still dealing with this issue that that Thoreau would have hoped to resolve 160 years ago, and it's still alive today in the U.S. So Thoreau hadn't paid taxes for 6 years. It runs into a guy who picks him up because of this problem. And this again is Thoreau's, idea. The core idea here is that, you stop supporting a system and the system is going to collapse. It will hopefully end. That's the idea behind it. And, the key notion here is you have to withdraw support from the project. Yep. You can see what, Thoreau's thinking here with civil disobedience as also being on display in Walden insofar as his approach to consumerism, which we'll get to in the next lecture in more detail, but just to connect it and frame it with the essay on civil disobedience. how do you deal with consumerism? How do you deal with, this industrial revolution we've had and, all this stuff on offer? Well, you can do what Thoreau did and just sort of opt out as much as possible from the system. Decide not to give your support to the system. Sometimes people will call that voting with your dollars, so that, instead of, you're actually, supporting by buying things from fast fashion outlets, whether it's Zara, Forever 21, H&M, or whatever. You're supporting that project. Now, how can you not support it? Well, not to spend your money there. And if everyone stopped supporting brands that are bad for the planet and for other people across the planet, like Bangladesh and elsewhere, if everyone stopped doing that today, those companies would end very quickly, because we supply them. We, just like paying taxes, we support the government that allows these things to happen. We support these companies directly that allow it to happen. But Thoreau's a little different than voting with your dollars insofar as if you had just the same amount of money, that would mean that you would go and spend it elsewhere. So you wouldn't be buying those brands, but maybe other brands. And Thoreau's suggestion is a little deeper than that, or in a sense more radical than that, because what he's saying is, well, yeah, but try not to work much at all. And Thoreau would like to cut down the amount that he's working to a fraction of what the average U.S. citizen was doing at the time. And as a consequence, you'll support the system far, far less. So in other words, in terms of buying clothing in like a 21st century context where we buy like over 60 items of clothing a year, each of us does. Well, Thoreau would say, but, stop spending all that money, stop devoting all your life to making that money, and instead go ahead and work less, spend less, and that in turn will sort of take support away from those companies. But it's not like it's not just spending, voting with your dollars the way you spend it, but voting with with far fewer dollars, so that it has more of effect, because it actually would pull back the system. And if everyone were to do that, who's again, not everyone on the planet, a lot of people don't have money to buy a lot of clothing and all. But of all those people who were, on average buying 60 more items of clothing, drop that back to like 1/10 of that, like maybe 6 items of clothing a year, that would radically change the system. And in a way, I think that's, Thoreau's being seen as doing something similar here. So Walden Pond, just to give you a little perspective on it, this is Walden Pond, 20 miles outside of Boston. It's about the size of the UCSB campus. So what I mean is the pond here is maybe bigger than it looks. It's about the size of the UCSB campus. So it's pretty large, but not that large, really, when you think about it. So it's not wilderness, though. So if you go back, and I'll just go back to that last slide, and you look down at it, or you look, across at it, yeah, that looks like it's pretty much wilderness. Well, right there, that's a rail line that goes through, and it was in there in Thoreau's time, and it's still there today as a commuter line. But it's not wilderness. It had been, not only had a rail line been put in, but it had been clear cut before, so that's all second growth forest, and Thoreau later in the book, in chapters that you don't read, talks about previous inhabitants there and all. But don't think that this is like wild, untouched wilderness where no one has been before. Human beings have been all over the Walden Pond area for centuries, and Thoreau even wants to look back to the pre-European people who were living there as well. This is it, just to kind of give you an idea, its proximity to Concord. It's very close, and this is a modern photograph, obviously taken from an airplane, but you can see where all the housing and all is there. For Thoreau, it would have been very much like that too, and not built with that kind of density and all, but it would have been similar, with respect to having people living relatively close to him at Walden Pond. So again, it's not wilderness in any modern sense, but he would like to write about it like it's wilderness, and it's a good sort of cautionary thing to keep in mind when you read it, that, don't buy into it. He's portraying it in a certain way, and I think very effectively that way, but it's not really what he says it is. And I think it's good to think about in general with Walden. Okay, we're going to spend the entire next lecture, number 14, on it, looking at Walden in detail, especially the way that it has been influenced by the works that we've been reading. So, and again, in many ways, Walden is sort of a culmination of everything that we've read so far. But we'll take that up next time. So, okay, until then, take care.